I can't believe it's over. Truly, I am devastated. So, the last season of Netflix's A Series of Unfortunate Events came out, which I definitely did not binge watch in one sitting. It's a little bittersweet because as someone who read the books and was dying to see them all adapted ever since I was a kid, I no longer have any more content for the series to look forward to. Well, unless they adapt all the wrong questions. To be honest, while I enjoyed season 1 well enough and really enjoyed season 2, I was kinda hesitant about the third season. I mean, I was looking forward to it, but I had read a bunch of interview content where the producers mentioned answering several questions that weren't answered in the book series and tying up some loose ends from the books. And part of what I loved about the series, both now and as a child, was that the mystery aspect was really well done. The series answered just enough questions to keep us satisfied, but it was also shrouded in mystery enough that it felt like we were given a very small look into this massive organization that was so old and so complex that it's possible that all of the answers, and everyone who knew those answers, died years ago. But that was okay because the central focus was the inner lives of these very smart children who were trying to navigate this complex world that didn't always give them those satisfying answers. And as a kid, that really rang true for me. That feeling of coming into this big, vast world and wanting to know all of the answers to every question, but having to kind of make peace with not reaching a satisfying conclusion to everything right away was really relatable to me, and it is true to life. Endings are not always tied up in a neat and easy to swallow bow. They are often very messy. And as a kid, when all of the other books that I read had these happy fairy tale endings that were not true to my life and my reality, an ending like this was actually really welcome. Like, that's what it's like. Thank you for not talking down to me, Lemony Snicket. So I was a little bit hesitant. Of course, I wanted to know what was in the sugar bowl and whether the Baudelaires survived their journey, but I wasn't sure if any answers to that question would really be satisfying. However, I am happy to report that the conclusion to this series was a valorous, fun denouement. To be honest, I did have some trouble getting into the first couple of episodes of the series. I appreciated the way the series recap was done, but even coming right into it after having watched season 2, the first episodes seemed a little bit busy in their pacing. On one hand, I'm glad it wasn't suffering from the slow pacing problem of the first season, but it did feel like a lot was being jam-packed into that first episode. And I get it, a lot happened in the previous season, so they need to remind us of all of that in an organic way, introduce in a bunch of new characters and plot elements, and develop the Sunny Fernan friendship so that the second book of the season makes sense. And I'm very glad that it was split into 2 episodes and not just condensed into 1, and 3 would have been too many, but I just wish that first episode had been a little longer. Since Netflix doesn't have to contest with commercial breaks, they really could have spared an extra 10 minutes to just slow down and give us those lacking emotional beats. I especially felt that way about Olaf's character at first. I really love that the Netflix series has explored the darkness of that character more than the movie, where he felt like a cartoon character 100% of the time. But for those first episodes, instead of seeing what I like, which is a really well done balance of the outlandishness and then that underlying darkness, it instead felt like Neil Patrick Harris was just rapidly switching between the two, which made me a little bit worried about the tone for the rest of the season. Luckily enough, by the time the Grim Grotto episodes came out, a lot of that did end up being resolved. Once they had introduced all the new characters and mysteries, and we finally got a good sense of what the game was going to be for the rest of the season, we finally got some breathing room, and I really ended up enjoying where they went and what they did with the rest of the season. The acting was excellent. I remember at the very beginning of the show, some of the kids' eloquent dialogue felt super stilted, but all 3 of them knocked it out of the park for seasons 2 and 3. I was especially impressed with Melina Weissman's performance as Violet, just top notch. I loved it. The only performance that I didn't love was the kid playing Quigley, but his role was pretty small, so I was also really happy with Sunny's development throughout the series, and although I was a little bit worried at first that she was the only sibling who was going to get to grow and Klaus and Violet were just going to remain kind of formulaic as characters, we got some really great moments for them too, development-wise. They both got minor romance arcs, and while to me the romances themselves did feel a little bit forced, which I also felt was the case for the books, the development that ended up coming from those arcs was really appreciated. I enjoyed watching them become less trustful of the black and white moral compass that they were previously sticking to religiously, and I had a lot of fun watching them wrestle with various ethical questions and not always know the right answer. The Good Place jumped out. The Penultimate Peril was my favorite book in the entire series as a child, and the show definitely did it justice. I loved the visuals and the costume design for that episode. We finally got to see Violet in the ubiquitous purple dress from the book illustrations, which was very exciting to me. Aesthetically speaking, it was just a fantastic episode. I mean, they were all aesthetically excellent and really distinct from each other, but this one was especially pleasing. I also loved the way the narrative was handled. It was cartoonish when it needed to be cartoonish and emotionally striking when it needed to be emotionally striking, and those two factors were blended well enough that we didn't get these jarring shifts between the larger-than-life moments and the serious, grounded moments, which is definitely a delicate balance to maintain when you're adapting a series like this. Okay, now I can't see, but I think this is the elephant in the room. So the end, which probably diverged from the books the most out of any episode, is probably going to be controversial because of its answering some of the unanswered questions in the books and because of its ending. Before talking about the ending though, a few things about the episode in general. I really liked how they concluded Olaf's story arc. They acknowledged that this is a person who's experienced a lot of hardship and this is a human being who is capable of love and selfless acts, but that in and of itself doesn't undo that he did have a choice in his actions and he repeatedly chose to hurt people. So even though the show doesn't shy away from having the siblings learn to empathize with him, the show never lionizes him through his romantic feelings for Kit and doesn't try to revoke his status as a villain simply because sad backstory, which after all the Snape discourse was very relieving to me. Very well handled. In terms of Kit's character, I like what they did with her. I think she was a cool character, and I'm glad we got to see more of her in the series. My one problem with her was more of a meta thing, and it's just, in the books, she's Lemony's older sister, and they cast a 30-year-old woman to play the older sister of a 54-year-old man. I get that she was pregnant, so maybe they wanted a younger woman for plausibility, but I just felt like even when she was washed up on the shore and poisoned by mushrooms and going into labor, she had to be pretty and wearing visible makeup, which just kind of annoyed me for a series that's all about inner virtue and intelligence. Allison Williams is a great actor, and I have nothing against her personally, but I just felt like casting her was kind of a safe, pretty choice, and I just wish Hollywood wasn't so terrified of women over 35. Like, did she have to be wearing mascara after giving birth on a desert island? Whatever. That was my biggest quibble with this series. Other than that, though, I really loved the end, including, well, the ending of the end, which I am now going to talk about. So spoiler alert from here on out. So the books ended on a pretty ambiguous note. Olaf is dead, and so is Kit. The siblings are left with the task of raising Kit's newborn daughter on an abandoned island. A year later, Violet, Sunny, Klaus, and baby Beatrice sail off in their attempt to reach land, not knowing whether they'll survive the journey or what awaits them ahead. And that's where the book series ends. The books are told from Lemony Snicket's perspective as he tries to research the details of their journey, and he doesn't know what happened to them or the Quagmires after they sailed away. It's an ambiguous, bittersweet ending that's quite in line with the tone of the series, and it's one that I really liked as a kid, despite me wanting to know more. On the other hand, the Netflix series continues after this ending. Lemony still doesn't know what happens to them until he's contacted by a now preteen Beatrice, who meets up with Lemony and tells him of the family's journey back to shore. We also get closure with most of the side characters. Fernand and Fiona likely reunite with their stepfather, the Quagmires all see each other again, and Olaf's ex-troupe find a life as theater performers. Finally, we find out what was in the famous Sugar Bowl, something that both the original book series and the spin-off series All the Wrong Questions hinted at, but never ultimately revealed. In terms of the reveals themselves, I think they were all satisfying. The answer to what was in the Sugar Bowl makes sense and is consistent with its important role in causing the schism. What I think is going to be more controversial isn't the content of these reveals themselves so much as just the fact that they happened. I think a lot of people wanted the mysteries to stay mysterious. On the other hand, I think the change of medium from book to Netflix series was the perfect place to do this. Because in-universe, Lemony himself didn't know these answers when he was compiling the Baudelaire stories, something told entirely from his perspective wouldn't be able to reveal them. But with the existence of the camera letting us see beyond his inner thoughts, the series was able to introduce characters like Beatrice in a way that might not have worked with the narrative style of the original books. I'm glad the series took advantage of the new medium to expand on the story and didn't just give us a word-for-word recreation of the books. I imagine some people also aren't going to like the fact that most of the good people in this series ended up getting their happy ending. I can understand the argument that this isn't necessarily consistent with the tone of the series. You know, everything is always so doom and gloom, so to give them this fairy tale ending might feel like a Disney cop-out. And if I had watched this a few years ago, I might have agreed with that. But I think Besides the fact that I wouldn't necessarily call this a completely happy fairy tale ending so much as something bittersweet, the world is kind of lacking stories like this. When I was a kid, it was exciting to see a story where the main characters faced hardship and the narrative tone was a bit cynical and honest about how the world was not a perfect place. Because when you're a kid going through a difficult time, you already kind of have an idea that this is true. It's satisfying for someone to validate you and acknowledge that and say, yes, the world can be shitty, you're not alone. I think having a story that acknowledges that can be cathartic for people who are suffering while just trying to shove unbridled positivity down the throats of people for whom that positivity is not always their reality feels out of touch. But I think the show has already done such an excellent job of showcasing the suffering that has happened to these characters and how profoundly it can affect some people. Adults don't always have your best interest in mind. The world is not a dichotomy of good people and bad people, and sometimes you do have to make hard decisions. That message of you are not alone has definitely been conveyed. And in the often shitty world that we live in, a story that concludes with a family doing their best to recover and be happy together is honestly welcome. It's not a fairy tale ending where everything is perfect for these people. It's several characters doing their best in a tough world to heal and live a better life through their connections with each other. I think in the world we're currently living in, that's a great message to convey, and one that I don't think is inconsistent with the larger themes of the story. Yeah, the world sucks sometimes, and we go through these hardships, but at least we have each other, and we can do our best to love and move forward with what we have. To be honest, for some reason it kind of reminded me of the ending to the musical Into the Woods with the Children Will Listen number. That's also a great deconstruction of these fairy tale tropes with similar themes of questioning what kind of world we're raising children in. In both these stories, we have this theme of parents do their best to prepare their children to face the world, but they're not always successful. Sometimes you find yourself unexpectedly alone in that world, but you still have to move forward and do your best with what you have. In a world where we're constantly being bombarded with messages of everything is horrible all the time, I appreciated having a series that acknowledges the various frightening developments in life, but still gives us an ending that tells us that these things are survivable. So, as a whole, this season did have a few stumbles, but it was an excellent way to finish the series off. I'm sad that it's over, but I'm still very fond of this delightful adaptation.